This edition of Monocle on Saturday was first broadcast on the 26th of October 2024. Hello, I'm Georgina Godwin, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. This is Monocle on Saturday. Coming up on today's programme, we'll have a look through the week's news and culture with the writer, broadcaster and Russia analyst Stephen Dalziel. Then,
starting from the very first year, we saw there was this community feeling.
Monocle's Hannah Lucinda Smith speaks to the co-founder of Istanbul's Minoa bookshop about how they turned a passion project into a cultural success story in the city. And finally, we head to a hilltop town in Sicily for a tour of all the best culinary spots. That's all ahead here on Monocle on Saturday with me, Georgina Godwin. First though, here's the news. Israel struck military sites in Iran in the early hours of this morning. According to the US, which was notified in advance, targets did not include energy or nuclear facilities. Iran says its air defences successfully tracked and countered Israeli aggression, and there was some limited damage. A semi-official Iranian news agency vowed a proportional reaction against Israel. Georgians vote today in a parliamentary election depicted by both sides as an existential battle that will determine whether the country integrates closely with the West or leans back towards Moscow. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the ruling Georgian Dream Party has moved the country decisively back towards Moscow's orbit, accusing the West of trying to lure it into war. The opposition calls the shift a betrayal of Georgia's European future. And in the United States, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump took a detour from barnstorming the battleground states that will decide November's election with Friday stops in Texas, a conservative state that was the first to implement a near-total abortion ban. Superstar singer Beyoncé, who was born in Houston, fired up the crowd by introducing Harris, who came on stage to a recording of Beyoncé's song, Freedom. And that's your Monocle Radio News. Hello and welcome to Monocle on Saturday, and welcome to my guest, the writer, broadcaster and Russia analyst Stephen Dalziel. Good morning to you, Stephen.
Good morning, Georgina.
I would like to jump straight in with this story about Israel because it's been long anticipated. Nobody's known exactly what's going to happen. We knew they would try and take some retaliatory action against Iran. They've finally done it in the early hours of this morning. What do we know?
Well, we have to be very careful with this because it's still early days in terms of the news that's coming through. But we know for sure that Israel has replied to the Iranian attack when Iran on the 1st of October fired 200 missiles at Israel. And Israel has been saying ever since, we will retaliate. The United States has been heavily involved because they have said to Israel, whatever you do, don't strike the oil or energy or nuclear facilities in Iran. And so far, that's why I say I'm being cautious, but so far it seems that they've listened to that and they appear to have gone after military targets. But it's just another example. We've had a lot in the past year from the Middle East where we wake up in the morning and we turn on the news and the first thing is that there's been an attack one way or the other. In many cases it's been Israel retaliating for attacks on it, either against Hamas in Gaza or against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now with Iran coming in as well. This is, of course, the big worry for the world because Iran is not Hezbollah or Hamas. I mean, this is it's a serious country. It has some serious problems for the world. So I think we all sort of slightly hold our breath and wait and see what the news is. Of course, the Iranians are saying they shot down most of the missiles. There's a little bit of damage, as you said in your news bulletin. But the next thing is, what happens next? Does Iran now retaliate to this retaliation? And now the last time that Iran and Israel threw missiles at each other, actually, that was it. It was one from one side, from Iran first, and then Israel replied. And that was considered the end of that particular episode. The worrying thing is, of course, Iran now is saying, well, there will be retaliation. Is this yet another step to what could be an all-out war in the Middle East.
Absolutely. But as you say, early days, this is a story that will be following across the next few days. A US official has said that they consider the operation to be an end to the exchange of fire between Israel and Iran. And of course, US right now under Joe Biden, this is what we expect. Should there be a Trump victory in America? Who knows?
Exactly. And there is a line that's going around saying that Netanyahu has been behaving the way he has, and perhaps somewhat cautiously, and hasn't retaliated. It's taken, over 3 weeks for him to retaliate to Iran's strike, because he's playing for time, because he thinks he'll get a better deal from America if Trump is elected. Because, of course, there's this situation in America where you have the elections in November, but the new president doesn't come until January. Well, effectively, if Biden has and the Democrats have lost, then that makes Biden a real lame duck president. And Netanyahu, I'm sure, will be deep in conversation with Mr. Trump in the couple of months until he actually takes office.
Yeah, Netanyahu, of course, not the only person being influenced by the idea of a Trump victory. Jeff Bezos, too. Now, he, of course, the man behind Amazon, but he also owns the Washington Post. And for the first time in 30 years, the Post has said that it won't endorse either candidate. This has caused an absolute uproar.
Yes, it has, because actually I sort of should hold my hand up and say I'm a great fan of the Washington Post, and I have a subscription and I look at it every day. And it's perfectly clear that on which side lies the Washington Post's interests. They are clearly behind the Democrats. And so their journalists are angry to be told, we're not taking an official line. I find it odd in so much as you just have to look at the way their news has been developing over the last few weeks and months. Rather depressing until Biden stepped down and then Kamala Harris was appointed the candidate for the Democrats. There was a real upsurge. But funnily enough, literally only yesterday I was just looking through this week's editions and thinking, even if I know it's a terrible thing just to look at headlines, and one should always read the whole story, but there are only 24 hours in the day for other things to do as well. But the headlines in the past week in the Washington Post all say to me that there's a subtext that this is not going to go the way we want. There's a kind of worry in their headlines, and indeed when you go into the stories you see it in more detail, that they do seem to be, the journalists of the Washington Post do seem to be very worried that Trump is going to win this election in a way that they weren't 6 weeks ago. So they will, I think, feel somewhat betrayed by Mr. Bezos saying, well, we're not going to take an official line.
They're hugely betrayed. Many of them have written about this. There have been some resignations. Of course, people across America in droves are cancelling their subscriptions. The journalists are begging them not to, saying it's ordinary journalists like us who are trying to tell the truth, who are trying to be impartial and out there, that suffer if you do that. But of course, the real problem here is that Jeff Bezos is obviously looking to a future with Trump in charge, and the fact that he is going to loosen regulations, that Bezos could lose a huge amount of money if Trump saw him as an enemy, which he almost certainly would do if the Post came out in support of Harris.
I think he's going to anyway, though. That's the point. The reason that I read the Washington Post is because the journalism is so good. The way they write their stories, it's refreshing. It's good language. It's even if there is a bias, you can tell which way it's going, and they have an edition, an email edition comes out every opinions, so it makes it quite clear. These are opinions. They're not ashamed to put forward opinions. They're not, if I can put it this way, they're not the BBC where opinions are supposed to be forbidden because you're giving a balanced view of the news. So they have their opinions, but they also report the news very well. So yes, I have great sympathy with the journalists if people are cancelling their subscriptions, but I find it odd that, less than 2 weeks really before the elections, they're saying, no, we're not going to take a position. It's quite clear. Just look at this week's headlines. You can see what their position is. It's
but obvious. Also, if this announcement had been made 4 years ago, 5 years ago, whatever, nobody would have blinked. It wouldn't have. But saying it now at this time, I think he's wanting to draw attention to it for some reason. And also, I wonder that an endorsement by the Washington Post, would that really sway Trump voters? They don't read that.
No, indeed, that's the point. They don't read the Washington Post. I think that something you also mentioned in this morning's news, Beyonce coming out and saying, vote Harris, actually will have far more resonance with the people across the United States than what the Washington Post says. So I think it's a pity. I think their position's clear. Why not be honest about it and just take the consequences if they come.
And it's also just the interference from an owner. You want to think that your editorial board and your editor is the one making decisions and not the money man.
You would hope so.
The Washington Post has been very good reporting on Georgia, where, of course, elections are taking place today. Now, I know this is something that you've had a vested interest in for some time.
Yes, I'm a great fan of Georgia. But one of the things that actually is quite amusing is that if you do a search, I did a search yesterday on Google, Georgia election. Everything that came up was about the state of Georgia in the United States of America.
Georgia Confederates, not Caucasus.
If I put in Europe Georgia election, then it produced the information that I was after. It's one of these. It's a peculiar thing. It's because St. George is the patron saint of the country. We have it's Georgia in English. It's Sakartvelo in Georgian, so it's completely different. And it's Gruzia in Russian. And Russian is appropriate here because the worry is that the party that's currently in control of Parliament, Georgian Dream, which for many people has become Georgian Nightmare, they were elected in 2012, and they are run, the chairman now, he was prime minister for a year, but now the chairman, Bidzina Ivanishvili, made all his money in business in Moscow, in banking and in telecoms. And in the last year, actually, it hasn't been that very long, but the twist of Parliament has been very much with a Russian focus. Georgians, the majority of Georgians, according to a poll in March of last year, so fairly recently, 85% want Georgia to join the European Union. Well, the Parliament has introduced two laws in recent months that have the stamp of Moscow all over them. One is the Foreign Agents Law. So just as in 2011, Russia introduced this law, and anyone who's stamped as being a foreign agent has to put this on anything they publicise. And of course, it's seen as a way of trying to take influence or take money or get people away from anyone who's dubbed as a foreign agent. Well, they've now got that in Georgia, which I remember when I saw this coming, I thought, what? In Georgia? And then looked into it more and found that this is this twist that Ivanishvili has. Clearly he's behind it. He's no longer the prime minister, but he's the one who's pushing his party to do this. Again, with the stamp of Moscow, making it much more difficult for the LGBTQ community, restricting some of their freedoms, and that definitely smacks of Moscow. So what we're seeing now, there's Georgian Dream, as I say, the ruling party at the moment, and there are four opposition movements who, in the past, has often been the case in the post-Soviet space, they can rarely agree with each other. Now they have decided today, ahead of these elections, parliamentary elections, to say, look, our main aim has got to be to stop Georgian Dream forming the next government and certainly having a majority. So they have actually been trying to unite. The election is today. We will see how it goes. The worry is that in some of the more rural areas of Georgia, there's already been intimidation has been seen. Whether people will be allowed to vote freely, people have been threatened that if you don't vote the right way, i.e. for Georgian Dream, you'll lose your job. These are areas away from the capital Tbilisi or cities like Kutaisi. It is quite a rural country. 20% of which, let's also remember, 20% of the territory of Georgia is currently occupied by Russia. We remember Ukraine all the time. We seem to forget that in 2008, Russia had a kind of rehearsal, as it were, for what happened in Ukraine, and occupied 20% of Georgia. An agreement that was brokered by the United States said that they agreed to pull out, and they haven't. They're still there.
Yeah, absolutely. And talking about Russian intimidation and so on, Navalny. So Yulia Navalny was here publicising her late husband's book, Patriot. Now, you are one of the translators
I am indeed. It's a very interesting story. I'll try and keep it brief, but there's a wonderful translator called Arch Tate, and no one outside a very small circle of people knew that for the past couple of years, Arch has been working on this translation. When Navalny was poisoned and flown to Germany and lay in a coma for 17 days and then eventually came out and stayed on in Germany for 5 months in 2021, he actually started writing his memoirs. He had said all along to Yulia, his wife, and to his children, something that old people do, I'll do it, in years to come. And he suddenly realised, having been poisoned once by Putin and nearly killed, that maybe he wasn't going to be around to be an old man. So he started writing his memoirs when he was in Germany, and they were fed out. I mean, it's not fed out to the west from Germany, but they were then sort of passed on very carefully without many people being told at all. So Arch Tate was starting to translate them. And the plan was that this book would come out. It might have been that Navalny might have been part of a prisoner swap, and so could have been released this year. But of course, that didn't happen. I agree with the line that Putin murdered him rather than just he happened to die in prison back in February this year. But once he died, it seemed to be even more important to get this book out as quickly as possible. So they said to Arch, look, the timeline has shifted. And Arch, who I know is a lovely man, he said, well, I can only do so much. He said, contact Stephen Dalziel. Because there's a network of translators from Russian in this country, not surprisingly, probably about 100 people. But not many of us do history and politics books. Most of them do literature or children's books. So Arch knew what I could do, so he got on to me. So yes, I had the great pleasure, I have to say. It may sound odd, but you might think it's a political memoir of someone who's been murdered. But it's the most readable, most entertaining, indeed sometimes laugh out loud funny book. And the language used wasn't simplistic, but it was straightforward. I think that's the best way of describing it. He wasn't trying to be clever and use fancy terms and things that I would have to rush to a dictionary or on the internet. What does this mean? My Russian is good, it's fluent, but sometimes you still have to check things. But most of this I could do sort of straight off, and then the skill of the translator is making it read not like a translation. And I think that anyone who gets the book and reads it will just read through it as if it were written that way. Most, I have to say, most of it is Arch Tate's work, but my work's in there too. And it was a pleasure to do, and a great pleasure to meet Yulia Navalnaya, Alexei's widow, at an event in London on Wednesday when she was here to, in conversation with Emily Maitlis in the festival hall, hundreds of people there, and then we had a reception afterwards, and we had quite a chat about the translation.
Well, let's stay with books, because Minoa is an independent bookshop in Istanbul, which brings together over 45,000 Turkish and English books from across many genres, including art, photography, gastronomy, comic books and more. The brand now has 4 branches in the city and even an outpost in Berlin. Monocle's Hannah Lucinda Smith met with the co-founder, Petek Tokuz, in Minoa, Pera, the brand's largest store, to find out more about this cultural success story.
On one of the busiest streets in central Istanbul, you'll find the latest and biggest branch of a local success story. The Minoa bookstore started with a single shop in the city's Beşiktaş district a decade ago. Today it has 4 branches across the city and an outpost in Berlin. I met with co-founder Petek Tokuz in Minoa, Pera, the branch's largest store, which opened last year and includes a coffee shop, restaurant and event space. Petek explained how, together with her architect husband Nizam, they turned a passion project into one of the city's retail and cultural success stories.
It just started as a hobby. We thought it would be a part of our life, and we would have this shop, close it on Sundays, just work for, from 8 to 10 or 10 to 8 in the afternoons, and then have this nice bookstore where we enjoy ourselves. But starting from the very first year, we saw there was this community feeling. Is why it was our neighbors, people from around Beşiktaş, and whoever heard about the shop coming there. And this community feeling and the reality that they really enjoy themselves among books gave us this idea that we can also support people buying more books because they feel good inside a bookstore.
And Minoa truly is a place where you can feel your mood change as you enter the door. The main focus are the books, of course, which are arranged to boast those products and architectural features, so that the coffee shop and the restaurant flow seamlessly into the shelves and one floor flows into the next. There are plenty of comfy sofas where you can get stuck into your new purchase or read one of the second-hand books that are also for sale. Intriguingly, Minoa mixes up its titles rather than ordering them into sections, meaning that it's easy to browse for hours.
The way you present books is not very typical. They're all mixed up and everything. I mean, I believe them 10% because we should have this labeling in a better way. But still, the way we present books is different because that's how we want them to be. It may not be a very, proper presenting that you expect from a big bookstore, but this is how we do it, and some people enjoy it. So of course we try to develop, we want people to buy more books, so we should do what we have to do, but it's how we want to do it.
In Istanbul, there is a rich tradition of publishing and bookselling. In every neighbourhood you'll find sahaf, antiquarian booksellers who stock everything from dog-eared paperbacks to leather-bound, rare and historic finds. But the sector is under multiple pressures. The surge in the cost of paper since the pandemic, coupled with the devaluation of the Turkish lira, has led to a decline in publishing output. Sky-high inflation has pushed up commercial rents in Istanbul, forcing many independent stores to close. And there is political pressure. Increasing government censorship has prompted many artists and writers to leave Turkey. But Petek says that Minoa has opened up a new type of space in the city.
We are very hopeful about it, yes. We call it bookstore business that is supporting culture, literature, and the lifestyle of Istanbul, inhabitants and people who are visiting Istanbul. That's why we kept on investing. It was very hard to keep on investing. This shop is really a big investment in terms of books and in terms of the decoration. And then we brought the brand to Berlin. We opened a branch there, but that is again to support the business here.
Next up, Minoa is working on its own publishing label, which will publish books focusing on elements of Istanbul's cultural life and Turkish fiction.
This will keep on the work going, our motivation going. That's also very important, our motivation of staying in the business, and get us related to parts of the culture and literature world who were a bit, demotivated and they don't want to produce anymore. That's lots of editors like that, translators like that, authors like that who gave up. They stay here, they have a house and they have enough funds to stay in the city, but they don't want to produce anymore because they are fed up. So to motivate them and to create again a group of people, a community. Maybe it's not going to be a very attractive place for all Turkish citizens, but it is going to be, I believe, like a love brand which certain people prefer to cooperate with in terms of publishing with it.
For Monocle in Istanbul, I'm Hannah Lucinda Smith.
Many thanks there to Hannah. Well, of course, books expand your mind, but so, I'm told, do drugs.
There's a link.
This is because I really want to talk about this story about scientists want to study Coca-Cola forerunner that contained cocaine. So a 144-year-old bottle of Van Mariani has been unearthed in Corsica, and the researchers are trying to find out if it really was a cure for impotency and nervous troubles. So they're having a look at it, that was the original. Then there was an American version, and it was sold as the most wonderful invigorator of sexual organs. Although those claims were toned down a little bit after the US forced the introduction of recipes free of alcohol and cocaine, and that, of course, then was rebranded as Coca-Cola. But I just find it fascinating that they're looking back at this old one to see exactly what was in, and that it exists at all.
Yeah, well, can I quote from Snopes, who've got a story about this, Snopes.com, and they say the short answer to questions about cocaine in Coke is that Coca-Cola did contain some cocaine, or more specifically, it contained ecgonine, a precursor to cocaine. But it also, you think, well, read Sherlock Holmes stories and see they're all on opium and the opium dens, and so. I think it's someone maybe trying to sell books or magazines or whatever, because it's we live in a different time when drugs are looked at in a rather different way, and apparently if there was any cocaine in the original Coca-Cola, as they may find or they may not when they examine this bottle, but it would be a tiny amount.
Well, if you live in Dusseldorf, you might have been going to a particular pizzeria. That always sounds like a disease. That's why I don't like saying it. And ordering number 40, because with number 40 you got a side order of cocaine. And this is very recently. Drugs Bust just happened. It was one of the best-selling pizzas at this pizza restaurant in Dusseldorf. And the police were tipped off by suspicious food inspectors. They began observing the restaurant. They discovered why pizza number 40 was so popular, because you got this Coke on the side.
I suppose people would go in to order it and say, "Hi, I'll have number 40.
Is that the code?
Or would they say the other way around? I'll have number 40. Now I'm high.
Quite extraordinary. Anyway, I want to stay on the theme of Italian food because we are escaping the grey skies of the city for the last of the season's sun. The elegant city on the coast of Sicily, that's Taormina, is filled with culinary gems, from authentic trattorias to contemporary wine bars and, of course, traditional arancini. I'm sure they do pizzas too, but without the cocaine. So Monocle's George Ruskin takes us on a tour of all the best spots.
Sicilians live to eat. You only have to hear some of the local idioms to understand just how many revolve around food. Siliciano la sarda, for example, referring to someone who licks the sardine, is how a Sicilian describes their arch nemesis. Mangiarno con la salvietta, or eating with napkins, describes something they have really enjoyed. And my personal favourite, non ni mancio chiacchieri, a pun on a delicious local pastry, means I don't eat gossip or engage in tittle-tattle. It is therefore no surprise that a visit to this island paradise is a feast for the senses, taste most importantly. The cliff-top town of Taormina, perched high above the Ionian Sea, is the perfect place to sample the Sicilian obsession with food. Sicilians begin their day with a sweet breakfast, and in Taormina there's no better place than Bam Bar. This cafe is famous for its granita, an icy Sicilian speciality somewhere between a slushy and a sorbet. The locals swear by the almond flavour, but if you ask me, you should try the lemon. A frosty granita served with a warm, soft brioche is as close to heaven as breakfast gets. Sit outside, take in the early morning sunshine, and enjoy the streetscape around you. For a more substantial morning meal, head to the Minotaur patisserie. Their cannoli are legendary. The shells are crispy, and the ricotta filling is impossibly smooth. My personal recommendation is the pistachio cannoli. The pistachios here are like green gold, and you'll be hard-pressed to find better ones anywhere in the world. After indulging in these Sicilian delights, take a stroll down the Corso Umberto, the heart of Taormina, where shops, galleries and Roman history line your path. And when lunchtime rolls around, you'll have worked up an appetite. Where does one go for lunch in Taormina? Trattoria Don Ciccio is the spot for a traditional Sicilian meal. Start with their arancini, Sicily's famous fried rice balls stuffed with meat, mozzarella or peas. Then move on to pasta alla norma, a dish Taormina does particularly well. Fried aubergine, tomatoes and salty ricotta salata. If seafood is more your thing, the spaghetti alla vongole loaded with fresh clams will remind you that you're dining in a coastal paradise. For those who prefer something lighter, Strifu offers focaccia sandwiches packed with Sicilian ingredients, or the zeppole, deep-fried dough stuffed with anchovies and olives, traditionally eaten during Taormina's carnival season. After lunch, a wander through the Villa Comunale is just what you need to work your appetite back up. This tranquil public garden has some of the best views in town, the sparkling Ionian Sea on one side and brooding Mount Etna on the other. If you're into markets, pop by one of the local food stalls to pick up Sicilian olives, sun-dried tomatoes, or even some pecorino cheese to stuff in your suitcase home. In the afternoon, it's time for coffee, and Sicilians don't mess around when it comes to their espresso. Cafe Wunderbar is the best place to enjoy a cup on Piazza Nuovo Aprile, one of Taormina's most beautiful squares. Order an espresso, or if you're in the mood for something a bit stronger, a glass of Etna Rosso, a local wine produced from grapes grown on the volcanic slopes nearby. As the sun begins to set, it's time to explore Taormina's dinner scene. For a traditional feast, make a reservation at Ristorante Al Giardino. Tucked away in a back street, this restaurant specializes in Sicilian cuisine made from seasonal, local ingredients. Start with the polpo alla griglia, grilled octopus that melts in your mouth, and move on to the involtini di pesce spada, swordfish rolls stuffed with breadcrumbs, pine nuts, and raisins. This dish, with its mix of savoury and sweet, reflects the island's rich history of culinary influences. Pair it with a bottle of Gambino's Tiefo Etna Bianco for a true taste of Sicily.
That was Monocle's George Ruskin for Food Neighbourhoods. And for more food stories, head to monocle.com/radio. And that's it for Monocle on Saturday today. Thanks to our producer and studio engineer, Mariella Bevan. And many thanks to my guest in the studio, Stephen DL. Monocle on Saturday will return next weekend with Vincent McAviney in the chair. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.